Okay, the numbers coming in is fairly static now, so without further ado, I will introduce you to our panelists, starting with Alice Gibson.
Good afternoon, folks. Up and pound da, as we say in my parts. My name is Alice Gibson. I'm a disability training and consultancy specialist, and that means that I deliver lots of disability and health related training, including things like mental health, first aid Wales. And I grew up in a really neurodiverse household, and that's why I've got such an interest in the topic that we're delivering today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alice. Over to Helen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Helen MacMillan, and I'm Operations Manager for a workplace adjustments programme delivered to the BBC, known as Access and Disability Services. I've been working in the disability field for over 27 years. I joined the BBC's early incarnation of the service, known then as the Access Unit, in 2002. And I've been handling the recommendation and implementation of workplace adjustments for the past 16 years or so, working across a number of contracts. And I specialise in neurodiversity. I have a specific interest in autism, which followed the diagnosis of a couple of close family members. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to the session.
Lovely, thank you, Helen. And then last but not least, I'll hand over to Kath.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Kath Wood, and I'm also a disability training and consultancy specialist, and have over 15 years experience in the field of disability and employment. And my interest in neurodiversity has started from pre that employment in other services that I worked in. And I've worked on a number of different resources for the business on the topic of neurodiversity, including a neurodiversity work toolkit and some training courses on neurodiversity, autism and dyslexia. And it's my job to kick off the webinar today. So very, very warm welcome to our Celebrating Neurodiversity webinar. And this is all about why employers should be doing more to develop neurodiverse workplaces. So we've got three main aims, and we're going to be taking a section each as we go through the session. So the aims are that we'll cover what is neurodiversity and why it's an important topic for the workplace. We'll explore some strengths and some challenges of a range of conditions with a focus on autism, and Alice will be covering the topic of autism. And then we'll be able to outline some simple changes that can help neurodiverse individuals succeed at work and how workplace adjustment programmes can help. And that's Helen's topic that she's going to cover. So let's start off with having a look at the topic of neurodiversity and find out more about what it is. So really it describes the way that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. And there is no one right way of thinking and learning and behaving, and that we value differences and they're not viewed as deficits. So the Harvard Medical School definition is really a great way of describing neurodiversity. It's the idea that people experience and interact the world with them different ways. So it's really important that we actually value those differences and allow those differences to flourish in the workplace. So it's also an umbrella term for a number of different conditions, including dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, autistic spectrum condition or autism, dyscalculia, Mears-Irlen syndrome and Tourette's. There's a wide range of conditions. There are considerable overlap between the various conditions, so some people will have multiple diagnoses or indeed experience a range of symptoms across a number of those different conditions. But not everybody who is neurodivergent is actually diagnosed with a condition. People could just experience traits or have a different way of thinking. It's also a collective term, so a community or a condition can be neurodiverse, but actually people are neurodivergent. So let's have a look a little bit more around the language and why neurodiversity is a preferred term and why it really is something that allows us to view the topic in the right, most positive way. So on the slide, you can see we've got a range of different descriptions, and all of these have been used to describe the conditions that I just mentioned. So the term disability, you can see on the side, we've got the dictionary definition, a couple of different dictionary definitions around limits people's movements, a disadvantage or a handicap. And a lot of the terms that are associated with the term disability can be perceived quite negatively. The conditions have also been referred to as specific learning difficulties. Again, the term difficulty emphasises problems, challenges and issues, and really want to move away from that focus onto recognising both difference and then looking at diversity. So difference is obviously recognising that people have different ways of thinking, but diversity actually provides the additional value that we add to that difference. So it's about celebrating difference, individuality, and recognising the true value that this alternative way of thinking really brings. So let's have a look at the prevalence of neurodiversity within the UK. So we've got a range of different statistics here. So it's estimated that around 10% of the UK population have dyslexia, and 4% of the population is severely affected by their dyslexia. For dyspraxia, it's around 6 to 10%, with around 2% being severely affected. Tourette's affects around 1 in 100 children, and there are more than 300,000 people that live with the condition in the UK. For autism, it's around 1.1% of the population have a diagnosis of autism, and actually it's more common in males than females, more probably linked to the way that females mask their symptoms and actually don't get referred for assessments early in education, rather than it necessarily being a male-dominated condition. For ADHD, it's estimated that between 2 and 5% of the population are affected, but actually only 120,000 people in the UK are formally diagnosed. And that certainly could be an issue for people getting recognition and support through education and into employment. For Erlen syndrome, it's estimated to affect about 14% of the population, but actually it increases to around 30% for people with other neurodiverse conditions such as ADHD, dyslexia and autism. And finally, dyscalculia, estimated to occur in around 3 to 6% of the population, just as likely to occur in males and females, and slightly more common in those people who have a diagnosis of dyslexia. But is a diagnosis vital to what we need to talk about around this topic? Actually, a lot of people would say not necessarily. So, does it matter if somebody has a diagnosis? For the person, sometimes it does. It can really help somebody to understand who they are, and it can help them understand and explain why they seem to have had challenges, certainly through education and maybe into adulthood and in employment. But receiving that diagnosis is not necessarily an easy process. It can take quite a lot of time, and people may also have to take a private diagnosis, so there could be a cost attached. Once you get the diagnosis, it's not always easy for people to accept that diagnosis. People can fear being labelled, being discriminated against, or being treated differently because they have that diagnosis. One side to consider around the diagnosis, it does provide legal protection under the Equality Act, because all of the neurodiverse conditions are classed as a disability under the Equality Act. So therefore they are protected from discrimination, and employers are required to make reasonable adjustments, or what we would call workplace adjustments. But actually we want to challenge that as the reason why people should make adjustments. We think that everybody should have the opportunities to flourish in work, and an employer should make adjustments to support individuals to flourish in their employment. Employers have a duty to look after the health, well-being, safety of all employees. So making adjustments allows people to manage their disabilities and health conditions and actually progress. There's also a strong business case to making those changes. And even some of them are very small changes that you can make. Because actually, if somebody is able to perform effectively in their job, they can perform better and increase productivity and the bottom line of any business that they're working in. So as we go through this section and on into the rest of the webinar, we're actually going to be focusing on both strengths and challenges, because actually you really need to understand both to be able to put the right support into place to allow somebody to work to their full potential. So there are a number of different ways of thinking, but across the neurodiverse community as a whole, we're going to sort of generalise to pick up some key skills and strengths that would be really useful in employment. And there are a number of companies, and certain sectors are really actually identifying the different ways of thinking are particularly attractive and can be particularly advantageous in those sectors. So these are some of the abilities and skills and strengths that could be of real benefit to most businesses. So neurodiversity is linked with being creative, having a great imagination, and it's not surprising that happens because people do think differently. There's also a natural curiosity, which actually encourages people to investigate situations and look at them in different ways, seeing things that other people wouldn't see. Many people with neurodivergent people are tuned into the detail and can spot things that we wouldn't notice. And actually they can also see beyond that initial surface, beyond the obvious, and focus out too. We're sort of taking that holistic or strategic view on things. Now, if you put these two things together, you can see why neurodivergent people are great at identifying errors, seeing patterns in information or trends in data. Many people who think differently also see things in a visual or 3D way. And this is thought to be much quicker to put information together into a single concept. So if you put all of these things together and layer them on top of each other, it's no wonder that one of the biggest strengths is problem solving. The neurodiverse brain is set up for being thorough, analytical, logical, using patterns or concepts to see a way through a problem, finding a unique solution. Also, through their experiences, many neurodivergent people will develop really key personality characteristics, which are fantastic in the workplace. Being thorough and methodical, being able to work on a task through to completion, even if this means a lot of repetition. So very thorough in the way that they work. Working hard to achieve a result, being reliable, conscientious, and through their own experience of maybe challenges in education, they will develop determination, resilience, and motivation. All characteristics that we can see will bring success to any team and any organisation. So let's have a look a little bit around some of the challenges. So I'm going to cover 4 of the conditions and then hand over to Alice, who's going to focus particularly on autism. So thinking differently presents a few challenges because the world is set up for neurotypicals. And some of these barriers and situations in the workplace have occurred without us even thinking that they could make things difficult for people. So we're not saying that things are deliberate, we've deliberately put barriers into place, but sometimes the neurotypical world is not easy to navigate if you think differently. So again, we're going to look at generalizing for each of these conditions. And again, it's always important to actually discuss how somebody's condition affects them with them as an individual and look at their own experiences. But we'll take some generalizations as we go through. So for dyslexia, it's commonly thought to affect reading, writing, and spelling, but there's a little bit more to it, which I'll move on to. So generally, people might struggle to read fluently. New words might present a bit of an issue, and certain complex terminology, jargon, and technical language could be difficult at the start. Some people with dyslexia struggle to express everything they want to say in writing, and sometimes you might notice that they can tell you fantastic bits of information, but the written reports don't really reflect that detail. There could be also spelling and grammatical errors that you might see in people's work. So beyond the reading, writing, and spelling, there may be issues around organisation, processing, and memory. So planning, prioritising, multitasking can be challenging. Doesn't mean people can't do it, they just might need to find different ways around it or different tools to help them. Some people may need a little bit more time to process their thoughts before they answer, and it's worth waiting for, so wait for the answer. And sometimes short-term memory and working memory can be affected. So for dyspraxia, many people have similar issues with organisation, processing, and memory. And there may be also some difficulties around misunderstanding and misreading information too. But it also affects fine motor skills, such as gripping a pen or being dexterous. And it can also affect gross motor skills. So people may walk differently and have some balance issues. It used to be called things like clumsy child syndrome, but actually it's much more than that. Some dyspraxic people also have heightened sensitivity to light, temperature, sound, or touch. Moving on to ADHD, there can be difficulty with concentration and focus. So people might have wandering attention, be distracted more easily, and really struggle to get back on task if somebody interrupts them. And they may flip from one activity to another, not be able to settle and focus. On the flip side, some people have hyperfocus and can focus intently on one particular topic. And actually the time can disappear before they realise. Again, there may be some challenges around organisation and memory. So again, planning, prioritising, and timekeeping might be challenging. They may seem disorganised, sort of have a cluttered workspace or lose things or miss appointments now and again. Again, with the right support in place, right tools to kind of prompt them, this can be easily dealt with. For some people with ADHD, they can have hyperactivity, which means they're highly energetic, are easily bored. But what that does mean is they've got a lot of energy that you can utilise in the workplace. And some people may also be impulsive, be a bit impatient, maybe tend to interrupt or say things inadvertently without really thinking. Again, it's about just understanding how you can make the most of their ideas and absorb all of that into the daily work. And finally, for Tourette's syndrome, it's characterised by a combination of involuntary and repeated movements that we refer to as tics. So these can be simple or complex, and they can be verbal tics, so simple verbal tics would be utterances, grunts, for example. Complex verbal tics could be words and phrases. And then for the motor tics, it could be things like grinding your teeth, twitching, or even quite more just demonstrative movements. So just covered an introduction to these 4 conditions. We're now going to move over to hand over to Alice to talk about the topic of autism. Over to you, Alice.
Amazing. Thank you very much for that, Kath. That was really informative. And just, yeah, loads of information. So we're going to talk about autism. Now, we often use the term spectrum in relation to autism, and there are 2 diagrams that help us understand what we mean exactly by a spectrum. So the first one, you can see that here, is a rainbow, and it shows that autism can affect people across all intelligences, from severe learning disabilities and learning differences to extreme ability or high IQ. Now, you will notice throughout this, I refer to this as people with autism as opposed to autistic people. And the reason that I do that is because I grew up with a brother with autism and he didn't like the word autistic. So it's built into me to use the phrase people with autism or person with autism. I do need to highlight, though, that that's very much a preference thing. So if you are working with someone with a condition, not just autism, when we ask about how it affects them, it's also important to ask, how would you like for me to refer to this, or how would you like me to refer to you? So when we describe autism, people tend to use the term either mild or severe, sometimes even low functioning or high functioning. Now, others say it's not the right way to look at it, and labeling people in this way isn't helpful. Although some people, might appear to be mildly affected or high functioning, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're less affected by their autism. And it might just be that they're able to use potentially their above average intelligence to develop better coping strategies or masking strategies, just so that they seem less impacted by their condition. If I could have the next slide, please. So there are some common areas of difficulty that we'll look at in detail later throughout the webinar, but everyone will be affected differently by their autism. And that's shown in the circle image. It was recently produced by the cartoonist Rebecca Burgess. And as you can see when looking at the image, it's a well-rounded view of the skills and the challenges, as opposed to the traditional linear view or even that rainbow image. So every individual with autism will have strengths or difficulties across all of the functions, and each person's pattern will be different and will be individual to them. So some people, for example, might have strengths with language and be really confident in conversation, but they struggle with their sensory processing. So maybe they don't like loud environments or busy environments. But other people might be absolutely fine with that environment, but have a real difficulty with just starting up a conversation. And it's an interesting way of looking at the condition, and it's likely to stop making people make those generalized assumptions about an individual with autism. Okay. So many people with autism find social communication and interaction difficult. So non-verbal communication can be a complete mystery to a person with autism, and they find it hard to interpret body language or facial expressions or even tone of voice. And they often don't use them in the same way that potentially a neurotypical person would. So they might struggle to maintain eye contact and actually find it really uncomfortable to try and maintain eye contact with someone. And this difficulty interpreting the non-verbal information can seriously affect their ability to notice social cues or to read people's reactions and to just generally understand how their message is being received. And it might mean that they struggle with turn taking in conversation, or talking for too long, or even potentially realizing that the subject they've chosen to talk about is an inappropriate topic of conversation. And relationships can be challenging for people with autism in a number of ways. It was thought at one time that people with autism didn't feel emotion or didn't feel empathy, but we now know that that's not the case. They might just struggle to express it in the same way that you or I would. So small talk isn't something that people with autism are comfortable with or even potentially understand. and seeking comfort and affection doesn't always come naturally to themselves. And that's why they can find themselves on the edges of social groups. And some people find it hard to understand jokes or humour or sarcasm. And we've all heard about it, where a person with autism is likely to take something very literally. So colloquialisms and sayings are too difficult. I used to work with a gentleman with autism, and I made the mistake of saying, "Take a seat," in front of me. And he just stood there completely blank-faced because he didn't understand what I meant. So I meant sit down, but he was trying to process what "take a seat" meant. So linking this, it can be hard for people to understand words with double meanings, okay, like taking the seat, or even finding the differences between similar sounding words. That can be a very difficult thing to process. So autism is also associated with difficulties in social imagination and flexible thinking. So that can have an impact on communication and relationships. And it's not always easy for a person with autism to understand what someone else might be thinking, or why they act a certain way, or how and why other people's views and opinions could be different from their own. And some people with autism have an intense interest in a certain topic and go on to develop detailed knowledge in that subject. And it's a fantastic asset, but there might be issues if that subject then dominates their lives and affects their abilities to focus on necessary tasks and concentrate. And if you consider the fact that the unwritten rules of the world are a bit of a mystery to people with autism, and then you add in this inflexible or rigid thinking, then it's no wonder that it can lead to a need for predictability and routine, and then also difficulties with change. Let's face it, who likes change? Now, people with autism can struggle with change of activity or something outside of their normal routine. And that might be linked to their inability to imagine what could happen if a change were to happen. So it's not easy for people to prepare for change and plan for the future, and they may have trouble coping with new or unfamiliar situations. And this in particular can be linked to really high levels of anxiety. Now, one of the lesser known effects of autism is sensory sensitivity. And that's where people are either more or less sensitive than other people to, things like light, noise, even their clothing and temperature. And some people might experience oversensitivity and others experience undersensitivity. So it's to one or more of all of your senses. So we've got taste, touch, sound, vision, smell, body awareness, and balance. So just as an example, someone who's oversensitive to sound might find a fire alarm ringing physically painful. And then someone who's oversensitive visually might find a room really overwhelming if it has lots of colours or posters, or if a lady has green hair, that sort of thing. Someone who's oversensitive to touch might not be able to wear certain fabrics. And then someone who's undersensitive to touch could burn themselves on a hot iron or straighteners or a radiator without even realizing. So some people with autism might also experience sensory overload, which is a term we hear quite a lot these days when we talk about well-being. Now, sensory overload is where you feel like you're being constantly bombarded by sound and light and colours and patterns and numbers and temperatures and textures and smells, and it goes on, and it can become too much because there's no sensory filter. And that means that the brain tries to process all of that information at the same time. So individuals might struggle with confidence and self-esteem, and they might avoid social situations altogether, completely doubt their own abilities, and find it hard to cope with change or show a genuine fear of trying new things. And there is some evidence that people with autism have a much higher chance of having an anxiety disorder or depression. And it can be difficult for people with autism to recognize a buildup of emotion or manage that emotion in an effective or socially acceptable way. And that's why some people express emotion through repetitive movements, which is known as stimming. And that could be rocking or hand flapping, or even using a fidget toy like a fidget spinner. And then on occasion, emotional or sensory overload for people could cause a meltdown or a shutdown. And a meltdown can be a verbal or a physical outburst, and a shutdown is the complete opposite, where a person will go quiet and passive and withdrawn. So people with autism have a different way of thinking, and that's what we've been talking about for the whole session. It can be a distinct advantage, and there are loads of companies out there specifically looking for employees with autism, because autism is associated with the ability to pay close attention to detail. And that means that many people are able to spot patterns in formulas and pick out errors that other people might miss. And people with autism often display a high level of concentration and focus on a task, and especially if the task is of a particular interest to that person or of a particular significance. And they might also have a topic that's of importance to them, so known as that special interest that we were talking about earlier. Now, in this case, if a person does have a special interest and a passion for the topic, they'll then go on to develop really highly detailed knowledge on that subject. And exploring that further may also identify hidden skills and abilities which could be utilised elsewhere in the workplace. And they're also likely to have an excellent memory for facts, especially when it's related to their topic of interest. So that strength is definitely useful in the workplace, especially in things like research roles and tasks where a level of expertise or expert knowledge is needed. And people with autism usually have a preference for routine and structure, and they're known to be thorough and methodical and meticulous about their routines and their rules and their accuracy. And that enables people to be accurate and precise, and they're more likely to be good at following specific instructions or processes. And it makes most employees who are autistic reliable, conscientious, and consistent workers. And some people, therefore, particularly enjoy structured routine or even repetitive tasks, which other people might not enjoy because they are too repetitive. So while people with autism might find the formal and the informal communications elements of work challenging, it does also mean that they're less likely to be distracted by the social side of work and office politics, and it'll increase their levels of productivity. All of this combined means that a person with autism may, be much better suited to particular types of work than someone who is maybe neurotypical. And certain examples of that could be an engineer or a computer program, a lab technician. My brother runs a lab in Sweden, and he was diagnosed with Asperger's as a child. And everyone was very worried about him. And he's now a very successful scientist because numbers and science was his thing, that was his particular interest. And now he's absolutely thriving. So something like a factory assembler or a stock controller, or even a data entry administrator, they're fantastic roles for an individual with autism. And beyond all of that, there could be tasks within roles that allow these individuals to use their strengths and their skills in roles that they can excel at. So I've just been talking about the workplace quite a lot, which I think is a perfect opportunity to hand over to Helen.
Thanks, Alice. That's really interesting. So I'm just going to begin with a general look at the approach provided by workplace adjustment programs. In a nutshell, we essentially identify those disability-related barriers in employment that prevent individual members of staff fulfilling their potential. So our approach supports organisations and managers with talent and retention, ensuring that individuals can work to the best of their ability and produce great work for their employer, as well as seeing their employer as an employer of choice, a supportive place to work and develop. Our approach also supports an organisation's diversity and inclusion agenda, again, being that great place to work with a great sense of belonging, but also helping drive up those disability stats. And then we're also supporting the organisation's risk management capability, helping managers to keep the employer on the right side of legislation. So we offer a range of services, expert holistic assessments. These are undertaken by certified disability management professional qualified assessors. And we bring the employee and the line manager into this assessment conversation where the employer feels that that's appropriate. We also provide non-clinical case management, and this process ensures that all the recommended adjustments are put in place. And as part of this, we can offer specialist procurement and funding support. So internal or external funding, for example, like Access to Work. And this supports an organisation in its decision-making and reduces spend. We always look for that best value option. We also offer an advice service, so providing guidance and support to HR, individuals, leaders, whoever needs it, as well as management information, data reporting, alongside expert insight to support an organisation's broader strategic aims. Have the next slide, please. Thank you. So now I'm going to move on to a case study, and this relates to a BBC production trainee. I'll begin by giving a little background. The individual referred to our service was in their early career. They had a recent diagnosis of autism, and they'd not had a lot of prior employment experience, essentially were just not job ready. In addition, they were still learning about their own strengths and weaknesses following the diagnosis. They said that they felt overwhelmed by the BBC, as well as the significance of the role that they just joined. The referral outlined issues in relation to performance, communication, attendance, and appropriate behaviour. The individual was struggling to hit what their management and colleagues considered an appropriate tone, and they were rubbing people up the wrong way, turning up late, and then following comments from the line management, rarely attending work at all. And then when they did come in, they were sometimes disappearing, walking around the building, looking at people's work and sending emails to senior management. It also seemingly had an inability to handle their workload, so weren't able to follow instructions or complete their training modules. And they also demonstrated a lack of focus on certain tasks. So further to this, human resources, the team leader and the early careers scheme manager were reporting an impact for them and the department too. So things like excessive management time, loss of productivity, and stress and frustration from the individual, but also themselves, concerns around failure, really wanting the individual to succeed in the role in their traineeship, and feeling a bit helpless and lacking in expertise and support. So if we move on to the next slide, so just to give it a little bit of overview of the process that we followed. We completed a face-to-face assessment with the individual and the line manager. We can do remote assessments on request, but in this case, everybody agreed that face-to-face would be best, and that we would give the assessor, this would give the assessor a better ability to read the situation and know whether time out was needed. We also built in some additional time for breaks. So assessments normally take up to an hour, but we provided 2 hours in this case to allow some breathing space. And the assessment itself was a guided, non-threatening conversation, gently covering all the areas of impact, thinking about elements of the individual's working life, including travel, training, interaction with colleagues, etc. And then we discussed and agreed the potential solutions. I'll come on to what we recommended shortly, but just to add that having the line manager involved in this part of the conversation is crucial to ensuring the adjustments were viable and that all the parties were on board with what was recommended. And then following the assessment, the report was provided to the individual and the line manager with a request for them to move forward with any local adjustments that have been outlined for their action. And then we moved on to the funding application support. So this can be quite an arduous process for some individuals. The case manager is crucial to keeping it on track. Sort of access to work can be quite complicated. We have a process of interim funding at the BBC. This is because of access to work delays, as well as access to central funds when access to work doesn't apply. So we also support with that. And then once the funding was in place, we moved on to the adjustment implementation for those costed adjustments. So placing orders, checking that all the adjustments were in place before moving on to the final stages. There's provision of ongoing guidance, checks, and gathering feedback ahead of case closure. So as promised, here are the recommendations that were made for this case. So we recommended co-coaching with the line manager, and this was to support the communication between the two individuals and establish strategies for better ways of working together. It's also an opportunity for the line manager to better understand the strengths and weaknesses of the individual and identify areas for the individual to work on in their one-to-one strategy coaching. And as mentioned, strategy coaching, this is for the individual to establish their strengths and also how those strengths can be utilised to support the areas of weakness. So the particular focus for this individual was on breaking the requirements of the role down and prioritisation and organisation strategies. And this was because the various elements of the role, the tasks, deadlines, meetings, coursework, additional last-minute requests from the line manager were becoming overwhelming and confusing. We also recommended an awareness session for colleagues to support their understanding and inclusion, particularly around the individual becoming overwhelmed and experiencing meltdowns and shutdowns, as well as their own communication style. We also recommended taxis, so travel to work support, and this was to support the individual's attendance. So they were essentially avoiding public transport because of anxiety and overwhelm. This was around sensory stimuli, and also around sensory stimuli, we put in noise cancellation, so headphones, fixed desk, quiet room when that was needed, and that also supported them around the meltdowns and the shutdowns too. So because this individual said that they preferred creating and accessing information in a visual format and that they needed tools to support their time planning and organisation of their work, we also recommended mind mapping software and the associated training to use it. Processing differences were supported via additional time provision, and information was provided in advance in an adjusted format. So for this individual, any linear written instructions also had print screens or images included as visual aids, because the individual had indicated that this worked better for them than words alone or verbal instructions. And then finally, to support a better understanding of the workplace rules and communication, etc., the manager and the HR business partner worked with us on drawing up protocol for specific scenarios, as well as more general and written workplace rules. And the department created an industry, BBC and role-specific jargon buster for the individual to use in their day-to-day work meetings. So just to provide a quick overview of the outcome of this case, the individual's attendance increased from regular absenteeism to 96%, and their performance and productivity issues were largely resolved. The individual's contract was extended by 3 months, and this was to ensure that they could catch up on lost time when the adjustments were not in place. And the line manager input also was adjusted, at first it increased while the adjustment programme was implemented, but it quickly tapered off. And then the line manager also said that they felt better informed and they'd established the skills to provide support while maintaining focus on the individual's development. The individual manager and the team saw improvements in communication and inclusivity, and the individual completed the traineeship and was successful in securing a new fixed-term contract in their area of interest, which was current affairs. And then to end on an extra feel-good note, both the individual and the line manager provided us with great feedback. The line manager said that they wouldn't hesitate in employing another individual on the autism spectrum. That's me. Thank you for your time, and I'm going to hand back to Alice now for final tips and takeaways.
Fantastic. All right, thank you so much for that. So up on the screen, we've got 5 questions to ask. Okay, because we know about the skills that neurodiverse people have. Hence, why wouldn't we want them in our workforce? Why wouldn't we want to utilise those skills? And once they're in our workforce, then why wouldn't we want to do everything within our power to free up these skills and these strengths and support those individuals within the business. And there's been lots of information in this session about conditions and strengths and challenges. But please remember that the information is general information, and everyone will have a different experience of their condition and how it affects them. But this should have given you a solid foundation of knowledge on the topic. But again, I'd encourage you to seek out further learning. The key thing, though, is to use the knowledge that's been gained in this session to guide your practice and to help you ask the right questions and have well-informed conversations. So the 5 questions up on the screen are there to enable you to understand how to apply this knowledge to support your colleagues and anyone that you're working with. So we think, how does your condition affect you at work? How can we make the most of your skills and strengths? What challenges do you experience at work? What changes the way that we work that could help you? And what do you want others to know about you and your condition? It's just reminding that we're putting that individual first. It is people first language. And when we put everything that we've got into that one person, then they'll give everything that they've got back to us. So I'm going to pass you to Kath now.
Thank you, Alice. So it's very difficult to summarise the takeaways. So we've got a top 10, but basically this covers there's a huge amount of more information that could be added to this, and that's why we have training courses that are considerably longer than this short webinar. But I wanted you to have sort of 10 things that you could take away to actually really make your workplace more neuro-inclusive. And that can benefit people who have a diagnosis, don't have a diagnosis, and actually it's probably going to benefit every single person in your organisation as well, because we all would benefit from some of these approaches. So communication is really key, as we've heard before. So communication needs to be clear, concise, and in multiple formats. So shorter sentences, bullet points, pictures, illustrations, plain English, as well as a verbal and written version of communication could be really, really helpful. I definitely think I would benefit from that. Time to process in conversation and just generally. So giving information in advance so people can process that information and bring it with them to a meeting or to a training session will be really vital in helping them to link that information into that core information they've already got. Distractions and interruptions, try and minimise them where you can. So if you have open plan offices, providing a quiet space or noise cancelling headphones, which Helen mentioned, just to block out those additional sensory inputs to allow people to focus. Breaking down your projects or your tasks into smaller chunks, really good to help with planning, help with organising and prioritising. But actually, if there are associated confidence issues, then you can actually celebrate mini successes as things are ticked off along the way. Providing that support with planning and prioritising, so chatting through a project, suggesting the use of tools like mind mapping, providing checklists and planners, and actually, again, strategy coaching can be really helpful for something like that. Minimising unnecessary change, I think we'd all benefit from that, but actually taking some time to prepare people for that change. So getting people engaged early on and actually allowing people to process the change and to see what that's going to impact, how that's going to impact them. Loads of different technology options out there. I can't go into detail in this session, but assistive technology, equipment would be really helpful. Things like speech to text software, mind mapping software, reading rulers, the list can go on and on. People support is really important, so workplace buddy or mentor. So we've talked about awareness sessions for colleagues. Well, not everybody is going to be comfortable with their whole team knowing all of their business, but it can be really helpful for a couple of key people within the team to know a bit more and to be able to support not just with practical tasks, but maybe a bit of emotional support. And certainly if people are unsure about their unwritten rules of the workplace, a workplace buddy is a great way of just nudging people in the right direction, of helping them to understand how things, the behaviour that's expected at work and how things are done around this place, if you like. We've talked about sensory challenges. So the working environment suitability is important. So sound, light, patterns, smells, The space that's available for people to move around are particularly important to think about. Again, trying to minimise those challenges where possible. And as Alice said, the number one tip is to ask the person. Everybody's going to need something different. It will depend on their situation, their challenges and their strengths. It'll also depend on the job that they're doing. So it's, again, hopefully as a line manager, you are the expert in the job. The individual should be the expert in their condition. So put the two people in the conversation together and you should be able to resolve most of the issues. And obviously you've got services like Helen works in that's there to guide and advise on that if that's not sufficient to sort out the challenges at work. Okay, now back to Nicole, and we're going to take some questions.
Much for that. I found that myself incredibly interesting, so I'm hoping that our audience did too. I'm sure they did, and we've had quite a few questions, so I'll pop some of them out there and just let you choose who you feel is the best. The first one has come: what would you suggest a manager does if they suspect a neurodiverse colleague? I mean, the latter end of the question as well, is there a specific OH provider you can recommend? Well, yeah, but yeah, what would we suggest if a manager suspects a neurodiverse colleague? How should they sort of start that conversation or approach that?
I'll take that one to start.
Yeah.
Okay. So the issue is, obviously, even people who are qualified and experts, it takes a while to diagnose somebody with a condition. So we can't really be questioning or labelling or suggesting a diagnosis to somebody. So actually you have to maybe present on and look at the challenges in the workplace and the strengths in the workplace and take the diagnosis or the condition out of it. So actually maybe doing some work around strengths and challenges in the workplace. So things like a stress risk assessment could be really helpful to identify what the pros and cons of different ways of working are, and really just trying to unpick some of the areas where you have suspicion as to, is there a particular task they struggle with, is there a particular environment they struggle with? Focus on the task and the environment rather than the diagnosis. And then, because people may also not be aware themselves, and the journey to everybody's personal diagnosis could be quite difficult for people, so we don't really want to add anything to that at that point. So just focus on the task and the environment or the challenge or the issue that you think you're having, and try and resolve that rather than focusing on neurodiversity, unless the person brings that up on themselves, I would suggest.
Okay, fantastic, thanks, Kath. Perhaps one for Alice. How can managers support an autistic employee in change scenarios where there is potential of sensory or emotional issues?
I think obviously it's going to be very dependent on the situation, so it's quite hard to give a broad answer. I think what you need to establish is what the main difficulties and what the main barriers are for that individual, and then finding like a personalized action plan as a way to support that person through those changes. I understand that from a manager's perspective, it can sometimes be difficult because it feels like you're singling a person out for being different. But honestly, in this scenario, that's not a bad thing, because what you're doing is you're tailoring the support that you can provide to that individual, and finding the best workaround. And honestly, my best piece of advice in that situation is ask the person, what can I do to help you through this change? Because ultimately they're the individual that's going to be able to give you the best answer.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alice. Okay. This is, yeah, quite a pertinent one. I think we mentioned this actually in part of our run through. So as platforms like TikTok have a lot of info about ADHD, and a lot of people are self-diagnosing based on symptom videos, some of our diagnosed neurodivergent people feel it is now become a little trendy. Everyone's saying, I'm a bit ADHD. How do we navigate through this? Don't know who wants to pick that one up.
I think everyone can comment on that.
It's a really difficult one, because it's like everybody's saying, I'm a bit OCD. It's a bit disrespectful to a diagnosed condition to use it in such a flippant way. But isn't it great that ADHD is suddenly a topic that we're talking about? So I see some pros and cons to it. The fact that ADHD is a topic they're talking about, and they're talking about it in such a positive way that everybody wants to be a bit ADHD, actually to me means that neurodivergence is actually not being treated so negatively, but I can see why people might feel a bit disrespected, and for it to be treated flippantly when people are jumping on the bandwagon, if you like. So my view is you just have to treat the individual with what they're presenting. So if somebody, for example, tells you they're ADHD and don't have a diagnosis, work with the symptoms, not the cause. But yeah, I certainly say to the people who perhaps are feeling a bit disrespected by it, that actually it's a good thing that it's on the agenda and it's out there in the public, public discussion, because it's massively changing the perceptions that it's people don't want to talk about it. So it's taking some of the stigma away, but I guess the downside is it's also a bit disrespectful of the difficulties people might have got to get to a formal diagnosis.
It's one thing I would say, just that it's been going on for a long time. Like Kath's mentioned about, the OCD. It's this just so happens to be the flavour of the week. With ADHD, not that long ago it was DID. So that these are all coming out of the woodwork now. I do want to highlight a positive thing that comes out of it, though, because Kath mentioned the stigma, and lots of people just haven't ever really addressed these concerns before because of the stigma attached and the fear of being not normal or different. But my aunt, she's in her late 50s and has just had a diagnosis of ADHD, because suddenly people around her have started talking about it, and she's thought, oh, well, this isn't just me, I'm not broken, I'm not a bad person, maybe my brain is just wired differently. And she went to do something about it and has now got that formal diagnosis and has got therapies in place, and is it's got the best mental health that she's had for the last 50 years. So some good things can come out of these social media trends. The dancing, not so much, but these sorts of trends, they can be quite good.
Oh, thank you. Another one here. So my son has autism, Asperger's. He is out job hunting, but finding it very stressful. How do we find companies or recruitment agencies that have these roles? He struggles with people and places. So, for example, shopping is not good for him.
Okay, so I'll happily take that.
Yeah.
So obviously we were talking about autism. My brother has Asperger's, so I do understand. A key tip would be to look out for the disability confident employers. There's a very easy way to find the disability confident employers, because you'll find the 2 ticks. Kath could talk about disability confident all day. But knowing what the key skills are, it's very useful to create a skills-based CV, knowing what the skills are and what the strengths are, and then specifically applying for roles that involve those skills and strengths. And Kath, do you want to say anything about disability confident?
So I was going to say exactly the same thing. So look, if you Google disability confident employers, you can go straight to the page and download a spreadsheet, which you can filter by sector and by postcode and by town. So you can actually identify all of your local disability confident employers. Alongside that, I would have a look for, go through your job centre and have a look for some of the employment programmes that are out there. So some of those work and health providers or restart providers are particularly good at finding partnerships with employers that can actually help connect you to the right organisations. Things like the National Career Service Skills Health Check can be useful to identify some skills perhaps that he didn't realise he had. And then maybe thinking about the type of, so matching the skills to the type of job role. So things like the engineering, the data entry, the kind of picking out the ones for his particular skill set is what I would suggest. And obviously with a lot of hybrid working now, there may be many more opportunities that could open up for him on part working remotely and partly in the office. So not having to be out in a more complex environment as often. So that's what I would suggest, have a look, maybe some remote and hybrid working roles as well.
Okay, thanks, Kath. Lisa Smith has asked, on the first slide of strengths, that she thought some of these were just associated with high intelligence. Are these strengths not common? I think that on the first slide of strengths, I think that might be in your slide, Kath. Shall I?
Yeah, no, happily, yeah. So I read this question actually in advance because I thought it was a really interesting one. So people's neurodivergence and their intelligence are separate. So being neurodivergent provides you a different way of thinking. It will coincide with your level of intelligence. So there are certain skills and strengths that are more likely to be more in prevalence when you have higher intelligence, the same as my skills and strengths would be more prevalent if I had high intelligence. So it's about separating the different ways of thinking from intelligence, because they're not connected. So yes, it might be more obvious when somebody is of average or above average intelligence that these skills shine through, but it doesn't mean that thinking differently doesn't happen for people with lower intelligence.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Lisa, for that question. What can you do at this moment? I'm just conscious of the time, actually. Oh gosh, we have actually got to 1 o'clock, sorry. So I will, I could just quickly throw this out there, shall I? If we've got quick 30 seconds.
Sure.
Yeah. What can you do if the person affected or having difficulties do not know that they need help? Or what if you cannot, due to workload issues, give them the sorts of works or tasks that do align with their strengths, and it starts to affect their mental health?
But I think I would refer back to what I was talking about earlier about strategy coaching. I would recommend that that individual, sort of undergoes some strategy coaching to help identify their strengths, but also to sort of work through strategies within the particular role that they're doing, and look at, how they can use those strengths to support any areas of weakness. And also it will give them some ideas of ways that they can work better in the specific role.
The only other thing I would add around workload issues is sometimes you might be under the misconception that it's about taking duties away that are too difficult. Actually, it's either using different strategies to complete those duties, or it's a swap. So there might be some tasks that they particularly enjoy and are particularly good at that other people in the team do not like and are not very good at and tend to leave to the end of the week. So it might be a case of switching duties and tasks rather than thinking you have to remove things to kind of make that better way of working. So just thinking about a bit of lateral thinking, a bit of creative thinking across the whole team, not just thinking solely about that individual.
Thank you very much. I have made a note of the other questions that we haven't had time to answer, and we can collate those and send them out in the next week or so. But I'd just like to say a huge thank you to the panelists. That was a fantastic session, and thank you so much to our audience for tuning in. I hope you found that really useful. Look out for the link that you'll receive via the email that you registered with, a link to the recording, which feel free to share with any sort of colleagues, peers, friends, whoever. So yeah, thank you very much. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone.